Okay, so learning topic for Unit 3. It's actually probably my favorite topic that we covered in senior psychology. So classical conditioning is very interesting. So, sorry, excuse me. So there's 3 major types of behavior learning that we're going to hopefully have time to have a quick look at all of them today. We've still got about 45 minutes together, so I think we'll definitely be able to have a look at those ones. So our first one is classical conditioning, which we're going to have a look at now, followed by operant conditioning, and then observational learning. So there are 3 major types of learning. So our first one is classical conditioning, which was actually first kind of coined by Ivan Pavlov. You may have heard of the famous experiment of Pavlov's dogs, where he actually classically conditioned a group of dogs to drool in response to when they heard a bell. Whereas the first time they heard a bell, it didn't make them drool, but by pairing the sound of a bell with the dog's food, which did make them drool, he eventually actually trained the dogs to drool just to the sound of a bell, which is quite a strange thought. So classical conditioning is about the involuntary association, so it's unconscious, you don't have to think about it, between 2 stimuluses. So we have 3 phases in our conditioning. We have our before conditioning, we have during conditioning, and we have after conditioning. So after the classical conditioning, after the learning has occurred. So we have lots of letters here. I'm sorry we don't have what they stand for written on the screen, but I'll go through what each one of them means. So UCS is the unconditioned, so UCS, unconditioned stimulus, elicits UCR, unconditioned response. So before we undergo any conditioning, so before the dogs underwent conditioning in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, which is something that naturally elicits the unconditioned response. So in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. The dogs did not need any conditioning, they did not need any learning. The food naturally elicited an unconditioned response, which is the natural response, which was in this experiment, the drooling. So the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, naturally elicits the unconditioned response, which in our experiment here is the drooling. And then NS stands for our neutral stimulus, which is actually our stimulus that initially doesn't have any meaning. It's just neutral. For example, the bell. It didn't mean anything to the dogs at first. And the neutral stimulus does not elicit the conditioned response because conditioning has not happened yet. So the neutral stimulus is still neutral, doesn't mean anything. But the process of classical conditioning is about associating a desired response with this neutral stimulus. So I know it's a lot of terminology, but we'll definitely spend some time going over that today to, hopefully make a little bit more sense. So during conditioning, the idea of classical conditioning is that the unconditioned response, so the natural response that's elicited in response to an unconditioned stimulus, so our natural response of drooling and our neutral stimulus, our bell, our thing that doesn't mean anything at first, are actually associated through repeated pairing. So how Pavlov actually did this in his experiment, how he actually classically conditioned these dogs, was each time they were given their food, the unconditioned stimulus, that produced the unconditioned response, the drooling. So what Pavlov did was he paired the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, every time. So every time the dogs were given food, they heard a bell, and the food was actually what was making them drool. But the interesting change is that after conditioning, the neutral stimulus actually becomes a conditioned stimulus, which elicits a conditioned response. So while during conditioning, our food and our bell are paired, and so the dog's given food makes them drool, but they're also hearing a bell. The dogs are unconsciously pairing and associating the food and the drool with the bell. And then so after conditioning, the result of this actually is that the neutral stimulus, our bell, which actually didn't even mean anything at first, becomes a conditioned stimulus, which is the neutral stimulus after conditioning has occurred. So after we've learned to associate a particular response with it, which elicits the conditioned response, which is your learned reaction to the conditioned stimulus. So after conditioning, when the dogs heard the bell, they actually drooled, even though there was no food, because they had learnt unconsciously to associate the conditioned stimulus and produce a conditioned response, which is actually such like an interesting thing that Pavlov discovered. So that's a quick overview of classical conditioning. Another very famous, very unethical experiment you actually might look at in class that's to do with this is the Little Albert experiment, which is very, very, very unethical. It's actually crazy to think of some of the things that they did in traditional psychology research, which has taught us so much, but is also quite a terrible thing. Because whereas conditioning the dogs to drool in response to a bell, some people could see that as unethical. There's no long-term consequences of that because that conditioning can actually be undone, which is what we're talking about on our next slide. But the issue with the Little Albert experiment was that struggling to remember the name of our psychologist at the moment, but our psychologist actually conditioned a baby that had the pseudonym of Little Albert to exhibit a fear response in response to neutral stimulus. I believe it was like a bunny or something along those lines, or a white soft toy that Albert initially was not afraid of, but the psychologist actually like made a lot of loud and scary noises when he presented Albert with the little bunny. And then after the conditioning occurred, Albert actually produced a fear response in response to the little bunny, which was once a neutral stimulus, but it had now become a conditioned stimulus, which elicits the conditioned response, which was that Albert would cry and be afraid. So that's actually incredibly unethical because this psychologist actually trained a little baby to be afraid of a previously neutral stimulus for no reason. And he actually it's actually unsure whether that conditioning process was actually undone. And even who little Albert remains a little bit of a mystery. There was some speculation that he actually died at age 6, but again, because it was all very unethical, it was very unregulated, it's actually quite a mystery and quite an awful thing for him to have done. We did learn from that, but that is a very, very terrible experiment that was carried out, which is why ethics in psychology is so important that we consider that and focus on learning about that today. So there are 2 experiments, just a brief overview of 2 experiments that you might hear in relation to the idea of classical conditioning. So these are the other terminology that I alluded to on our earlier slides. So generalization is when something similar to the conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned response. So an example of generalization would be when little Albert was actually conditioned to be afraid of, I believe it was the little bunny, like a white beard or Santa Claus actually made him cry as well because he generalized the stimulus. So actually a lot of white and fluffy things, my mistake. It was actually a live white rat, not a bunny. But when the stimulus was generalized, a rabbit, a fur coat, and Santa Claus all made him cry because the white fluffy things were enough, even though they weren't the white rat that he was conditioned to be afraid of. He was conditioned to be afraid of, by Watson and Rayner. They're our psychologists for that experiment. So little Albert was conditioned by Watson and Rayner to be afraid of the white rat, but because generalization occurred in classical conditioning, he actually became afraid and produced the fear response in response to similar stimuluses, such as the Santa Claus's beard, the fluffy bunny, and the fluffy white coat. They actually all made him cry, whereas previously those things had no response on him and they actually hadn't made him upset. Whereas on the opposite end of that is discrimination. Pardon me, when stimulus discrimination occurs, when something similar to the conditioned stimulus does not produce a conditioned response. So for example, if the white bunny had not made little Albert cry, he would have been exhibiting stimulus discrimination. Or for example, if you were attacked by a dog and that has actually caused you to be very fearful of dogs, generalization would mean that you're afraid of all dogs, whereas discrimination would be discerning that you only need to be afraid of that particular dog. So that's kind of the difference between our generalization, applying the response to any stimulus, and our discrimination, which is actually being able to tell the difference and only producing the response that you've been conditioned to produce in response to that initial neutral but now conditioned stimulus. On the other hand, extinction is actually when a conditioned stimulus becomes neutral again. So when the conditioning process is actually kind of undone and you stop producing a conditioned response to the stimulus that was conditioned. So that kind of relationship has stopped occurring. So for example, with little Albert, if extinction was performed, it's not documented whether it was or was not, which is a further ethical issue in this already horrendous experiment. If extinction had occurred, Albert could have potentially gone on and not been afraid and not produced those fear responses in response to the conditioned stimulus. However, again, like I said before, we're actually not sure if that did occur. So the process of extinction means that the conditioned response ceases to occur. The conditioned stimulus no longer produces a conditioned response and the bell becomes neutral again. The bell, thinking back to Pavlov's dogs. So if extinction occurred with Pavlov's dogs, when they heard the sound of a bell, the previously neutral stimulus, if extinction has occurred, then it's no longer a conditioned stimulus and they no longer occur in response. That response no longer occurs in response to the stimulus. And that can happen through repeated occurrences of that conditioned stimulus, the bell, without the association of the, like for example, with the dogs, the food. So if Pavlov had rung the bell with no pairing with the food, the dogs might have eventually relearned, oh, bell doesn't actually mean food anymore, so I am actually not going to drool in response. Whereas spontaneous recovery is actually when a previously learnt but now extinct behavior spontaneously comes back. So extinction would be the bell rings, the dogs don't feel the need to drool anymore, but spontaneous recovery would be one day if someone randomly rung a bell and that conditioned response actually just spontaneously came back. So that's our extinction and our spontaneous recovery if the conditioned response spontaneously comes back. Moving on to our second major type of learning, which is our operant conditioning. The operant conditioning is a little bit different to classical conditioning, and I believe I'll put some slides in on this. Our classical conditioning is association of a stimulus with an involuntary response. So little Albert and Pavlov's dogs were not actively involved in the learning process. The learning was not conscious. It was actually subconscious, whereas the stimulus was just associated with a response. Whereas in operant conditioning, the behavior is actually controlled by the outcomes or the consequences. So it's a consciously learnt behavior in operant conditioning. So for example, say if in high school, I know at my school, we had very strict uniform rules. So if somebody forgot their hat or was wearing the incorrect uniform on the incorrect day, then there would actually be a consequence of that. For example, they might get a detention. So the goal of that is the consequence. The detention is actually meant to shape their behavior. But the difference is the person undergoing the learning in operant conditioning, they actually have an active role in choosing their behavior. So for example, if a student received a detention, they actually have to choose, okay, I actually don't want to get a detention again. I actually need to change my behavior because this consequence, this outcome is or isn't desired. So our operant conditioning is about our learner actively making choices about their behavior based on the outcomes or consequences. Yeah, so coming back to our operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is a type of learning, like I said before, in which the behavior becomes controlled by its consequences, whether that be a reward or a punishment. So if I'm rewarded for sitting quietly in class, then I'm more likely to want to do that often. But if I'm punished for speaking in class when I'm not meant to, I'm more likely to not want to do that behavior as often. So an operant, which is where the name operant conditioning comes from. So an operant is a response that occurs without a stimulus. So our operant is just our behavior, our voluntary behavior, like what I was saying before. So it's controlled by the person or potentially animal performing the operant, the behavior. So the ABC of operant conditioning. This is what operant conditioning is. So our antecedent is the environment that makes the conditions right for the behavior to follow, and it can be reinforced or extinguished by its consequences. So we have our A, our B, and our C. So our antecedent, our environment, is the stimulus that prompts the response. Behavior is the voluntary response, and the consequence is the outcome. So let's go through a bit of an example to make that a little bit more sense. So if a parent was using the idea of operant conditioning to teach their children, for example, the antecedent, the stimulus that prompts the response, could potentially be if two siblings were fighting. So the antecedent, the environment, is right for the voluntary behavior response to follow. For example, if one of the siblings actually chose to hit their sibling rather than resolve the conflict constructively, that's actually the behavior that child has consciously and voluntarily chosen. So again, we have our antecedent, our environment is a stimulus that prompts the response, which in our example is our behavior, our voluntary choice to hit. The consequence, which is the outcome, the parents might actually put the student in time, put the child in timeout. That could be the consequence. So the idea of this is that consequence actually isn't desired. The child actually doesn't want to go to timeout. So the goal of that is to shape future behavior. So for example, next time a similar antecedent or environment comes up that prompts the response, instead of hitting the child might think, okay, last time I exhibited this behavior, I got put in timeout, which really was awful, and I don't actually want to have to do that again. So I'm going to voluntarily choose to maybe perhaps speak kinder to my sibling rather than have to face the consequence if I choose to act in an inappropriate way again. So that's kind of the basic outline of our operant conditioning. So the whole thing with operant conditioning, like we said before, is that our consequences are actually controlled, our behavior, the outcome is actually controlled by its consequences and the outcomes. So our outcomes could be positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment. And these are a little bit confusing, but it's definitely really valuable and worthwhile being able to tell them apart, because these can make for really easy marks on multiple choice questions or short answer questions if you can just kind of grasp what the difference between each of them is. So a reinforcer, so looking at our here's my laser pointer. So looking at reinforcement. So a reinforcer is any stimulus, so the outcome, the consequence, that strengthens or increases the likelihood of a response or a behavior. So reinforcement, like what we have here, is any consequence that says, yes, I want to encourage this behavior. I want to do it again. A reinforcer says, I want you to learn that this is a good behavior and I want you to do it again. Looking across to our positive and our negative. So positive, in the case of both reinforcement and punishment, means that something is added. A stimulus or a consequence is added. And our negative means a stimulus or a stimulus is taken away. So our positive, yes, exactly, think plus, something is added, and our negative, something is taken away to shape the behavior in the desired way. So thinking back now to, let's look at positive reinforcement. So reinforcement, we want to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Yes, do it again. That is a good thing. So positive reinforcement, we're thinking, what could we add to reinforce a behavior? Well, a positive reinforcer would be something like a reward that strengthens the response by providing like a pleasant or satisfying consequence. Keep in mind that when we're talking about operant conditioning, a consequence isn't a bad thing. A consequence might not be timeout. A consequence can be iPad time. A consequence is just referring to the stimulus, the outcome that's trying to shape the behavior. So again, looking back to positive reinforcement, something positive, something desirable is added to increase the likelihood of the behavior. So for example, in a classroom, if a student is sitting really quietly, they might actually be rewarded with some iPad time. So next time in a class, the student might be thinking, oh, okay, last time that I actually did this behavior, last time that I was really good and I listened really well, I actually got rewarded with iPad time. So the goal of that is to actually reinforce the behavior to make the student want to do it again. Whereas negative reinforcement is, again, we have our negative. So that means something is taken away to reinforce, so to promote a behavior. So how do we take something away to promote a behavior? Well, it's taking away an unpleasant stimulus to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. So for example, if you are being told to clean your room, or a child is being told to clean their room, but they don't want to, if a parent is nagging, the student might actually clean their room to get rid of the nagging. So the outcome of them cleaning their room is actually that the nagging, which is a negative stimulus, is actually taken away, which is to reinforce the behavior. So that means they're more likely to do that behavior again, because the reward, the thing to reinforce that behavior, was that a negative thing was taken away. So that's increasing the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated by taking away the negative stimulus. Moving down to punishment. So when we're looking at positive and negative punishment, we're looking at how can we reduce the likelihood of the behavior. So positive punishment, positive, remember coming back to thinking something is added. How can we add something to reduce the likelihood of a behavior? Well, that would be adding an unpleasant stimulus so a child knows that they shouldn't engage in that behavior again. So for example, adding nagging or yelling. If a child does something really dangerous or really unsafe, a parent might yell or tell them off or something like that. So something is being added so they know not to participate in that behavior again. So yeah, like I said before, like a parent scolding their child for fighting with their sibling. Whereas our negative punishment, think negative, something is taken away to try and reduce the likelihood of a behavior. So again, we're thinking, if I want to send the message that what they've done is bad, how can I make sure that they don't do it again? when we're thinking of negative, it's what can I take away to reduce the likelihood of this behavior occurring again. So for example, that would be taking away a positive stimulus. So hey, because you've actually fought with your sibling and actually behaved really unkindly, they might actually lose iPad privileges. So that's something that they desire. It's a desired or positive stimulus that's being taken away, that they're actually missing out on because they've done a behavior that they shouldn't have. So yeah, zooming back out to the big picture again, our reinforcers are to encourage the likelihood of a desired behavior, whereas our punishment is don't do it again. And whether that be through positive, adding a pleasant or unpleasant stimulus, or negative, removing a positive or a negative stimulus to encourage, either reinforcement or punishment. So that's our classical versus our operant conditioning. All right, our third type of learning was actually social learning theory, which arose from Bandura's experiment with a giant Bobo doll, which you can see on the screen is one of those like inflatable toys that has like a really low center of mass so that you can kick it and hit it and it can move around. So social learning theory is boiled down very, very basically. It's the idea of monkey see, monkey do, or if I see somebody else do something, I'm more likely to do that. Or if I don't see somebody else do something, I'm more likely to not engage in that behavior as well. So what to know about social learning theory? The number one underpinning idea is that people learn through observation, especially when the role model has like a particular power in their life. So for example, if you see somebody you admire or look up to engaging in a certain behavior, you're more likely to engage in that behavior as well. Or for example, I know when I was a lot younger, I had that very much like big sister idolization of my big sister. So if she engaged in a behavior and I observed it, I would have been much more likely to take on that behavior as well. The second thing to note is that mental states are important to learning. So how the learner feels affects how they're learning. And also learning does not necessarily lead to behavior change. So coming back to what observational learning is. It's a method of social learning, and there's kind of 5 stages that we'll have a quick look at here. So the first one is attention. So for the idea of these 5 stages is that if these 5 stages don't happen, social learning does not happen. These are the steps that must happen for social learning to happen. For a child to observe and then all the way move through to actually reproducing that behavior. So learning through observation. So first up is attention. So the learner must actively pay attention to the model, to the social model that they're trying to learn from. So for example, if I hadn't been paying any attention to what my sister had done, I wouldn't be able to repeat the behaviors and learn from what she was doing because I wasn't paying any attention. So it's almost, again, it's linking back to our memory of how can we bring information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. Well, we have to pay attention. Well, it's the same with social learning. If we're not paying attention, we actually can't store the behavior in our mind. So we're not going to be able to repeat the behavior if we're not paying any attention. And that's also influenced, like I said before, by how much you admire the model, maybe how you're feeling, how much attention you're paying, all of those things. So if attention is paid, we can follow through to retention. So the learner forms a mental representation of the model's behavior. So that also depends on the observer's ability to encode the information. So for example, if I was watching my older sister perform a really cool skateboard trick and I'm like, I want to learn that. So have I paid attention? Yes, I'm watching, I'm focusing. Second is retention. Can I actually retain that in like a cognitive kind of model in my mind? Like, can I think back through, okay, so what was it that she's doing? Am I paying attention? And now am I storing it in my brain? That's the idea of like actually remembering it, because if you can't remember it, you can't repeat it. Number 3 is reproduction. So the learner converts the mental representation into action, but they actually don't perform the behavior yet. The learner must have the physical and intellectual ability to convert the representation that we got in retention into action. So for example, if my sister was doing a really, really cool skateboard trick, reproduction is referring to, do I have the intellectual and physical capacity to reproduce this behavior? If yes, we can move on to reinforcement, the next stage. But if not, if I'm unable to do this skateboard trick because maybe I'm physically unable to skate, maybe my balance isn't very good, or maybe I'm just really bad at skateboarding, that means I actually can't learn that behavior because I don't actually have the physical or intellectual ability to reproduce it. So for example, if I met somebody that had a PhD in mathematics and they were writing up and solving this really complicated equation on the board, yes, I can pay attention. Yes, I can retain a mental representation of the model's behavior of solving that math problem. But no, I do not have the capacity the intellectual capacity to actually solve that problem. So if I can't reproduce it, we can't move on. But say it is a behavior I can reproduce, then we actually move on to reinforcement, which influences the likelihood that a learner will imitate an observed model's behavior. So reinforcement, thinking back to in operant conditioning, a reinforcer encourages the likelihood of a behavior. It is the same in social learning. So is there adequate reinforcement to encourage me to want to do this behavior? And if there is, then it flows through to motivation. If I have paid attention, if I've retained it in my mind, if I am capable of reproducing it, and if, like in operant conditioning, there's the appropriate antecedent, the appropriate environment, the appropriate consequence, the appropriate reinforcement, then I will have motivation to undertake the desired behavior. And so I will produce it. But if any of these 5 stages are missing, then we actually can't learn the behavior all the way through to not being able to actually producing it. So yeah, with motivation, we actually have to want to imitate it. So for example, with the skateboard trick, I might think it's really cool. I might want to be more like my sister. Like there's all of these different reinforcers that could be motivating me to take part in that behavior, which influences, like whether I will imitate and produce that behavior or not. And if there's a positive outcome of that behavior, then you're more likely to, be repeated to motivate it, whether that comes through praise or from yourself internally or externally from others. And an interesting thing to note is that reinforcement can actually come vicariously as well. So think of the idea of people living vicariously. For example, if somebody else is traveling, you might make a joke that you're going to live vicariously through them because you're not able to travel yourself. Vicarious reinforcement is a similar thing. It's actually when you're more likely to engage in a behavior because you witness the reward or the consequence that another person receives. So for example, linking back to my skateboarding incident, if I saw my sister learning skating really cool, if I saw somebody else copy my sister and learn to skate and they fell over and hurt themselves, that might send a message to me that it's actually not worth trying to learn to skate, which actually might vicariously decrease my motivation. Or for example, if I was sitting in class and somebody else put their hand up really nicely and shared an answer and they got a lolly, a reward for answering that question, then that's vicarious reinforcement because I've gone, they've received a positive stimulus for participating, for producing this behavior. So now I'm actually more motivated to produce this behavior as well. So that's actually getting motivation, not from having direct consequences or reinforcements applied to you, but you're actually learning. So it's bringing in that idea of social learning again by seeing them.